The thing that I focus most on in religion is trying to understand its role in influencing human sociality. So I'm
Mm,
interested in the problem of cooperation. So we've done a lot of research on how belief in the gods of modern religions leads people to be more trusting and fair-minded
mm.
in social interactions. So a simple thing we've done is we give people an experiment. We put a sum of money online, say $50, and then they can give as much of that $50 to this second person who is an unknown stranger. And we find that people who believe in more punishing, more knowing gods are more likely to give more. Astrology seems to be making a comeback. I get a Google feed on the word witchcraft, and it looks to
Oh,
me like people are searching more on witchcraft, and there's more articles about witchcraft prosecutions in Papua New Guinea, India, Nigeria. So
really?
I think there's
Yeah.
a resurgence of witchcraft interests.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. There's something about the sort of feeling of instability in the world. So this is an old
Mm.
anthropological idea, goes back to a guy named Malinowski at least, where when the world feels more uncertain, people resort to more magic and ritual beliefs.
What beliefs have you changed as a result of your going around the world and studying this?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing for me has been the recognition that people across the world think very differently. And one of the things that I sometimes get heat for is I think that the economic prospects of different populations are influenced by aspects of their psychology, which depends on many things. But one of the things it's affected by is this family stuff. So something like
Huh.
being distrustful of strangers makes your economic system work less well.
I think that should give us courage, exposure to other people's perspectives.
Moving us in a good direction.
Welcome to Conversations with Peter Boghossian. I just finished a fascinating conversation with a fascinating human, Joe Henrich. The Weirdest People in the World is his last book. He's a distinguished anthropologist and professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard. I mean, I'm telling the guy is on his own level, like truly a fascinating human being who's doing incredibly interesting and incredibly good work. Even if you find the conversation a fraction as interesting as I did, you'll enjoy it. Thanks for listening and thanks for tuning into the show. Joe Heinrich, welcome to Conversations with Peter Boghossian. How are you?
I'm doing well. Great to be with you.
You're one of the few people I've had on, and I just keep reading, and I've known about your stuff for years. It's truly, genuinely fascinating. I could have conversations with you. This is the first time we've ever spoken, and endlessly. But so let's dive right into it. So you've mentioned how humans are cultural learners, especially during teenage years. How do you think that phenomenon of social contagion influences current social movements or trends, like the rapid spread of certain ideologies or behaviors?
I mean, so one of the main things you need to understand when you're thinking about humans, and it applies to adolescents, but also young children, even babies, is that we're super sensitive to learning from others, and we're particular about who we learn from. So we use cues of prestige. Now, that was super useful in small scale societies of our ancestors, learning from the best hunters or the most prestigious members of the communities, helped make sure that we got useful ideas that made us more adaptive to the environment. But in the modern world, and especially with things like social media, people are exposed to this wide world of potential models, and things like following a particular individual is actually a cue of prestige. So people learn all kinds of ideas from people they encounter on social media. I mean, I think there's a growing body of evidence to suggest that certain psychological conditions are transmitted socially by observing others and seeing their behavior and whatnot.
Are you talking about cultural bound syndromes, or you're talking more on a micro level?
I think at both levels. So certainly culture-bound syndromes, things like eating disorders can transmit socially. There's good evidence on that going back to the 1980s. But
Mm.
also just things like depression, how you feel about the world. People's moods and emotions are tuned into the people around them. And it seems to operate through social media as well as in the real world. And so if you're around a lot of depressed people, that can make you more depressed. It can change your emotional reactions to things.
Interesting. Do you, if this is outside your bailiwick, tell me. I've often wondered if fibromyalgia was a culture bound syndrome.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that is outside of my area of expertise. But in general, again, without speaking directly to that particular thing, there's lots of things that are heavily influenced by who we learn from. So there are epidemics across history where there's one called this mad traveler syndrome, where people would
Yeah.
go into a state and they would just start wandering around the countryside. It used to be that women, upper class elite women, had fainting couches, and that's because they would periodically faint if there were shocking information presented to them. But of course, fainting couches went away, and so did fainting. But it's just an
Mhm.
example of something. I mean, that was a real factor in history.
Yeah, it's interesting. You'd have to know the whole concept of fainting couch is kind of fascinating. Like you'd have to be prepared for it, so you could be near the couch. So someone would have to say we have something, and then you'd go near the couch. It's kind of a reinforced behavior.
Right.
Um, Again, I guess I think my problem with you is your work is so just genuinely fascinating. I have so many things to ask you about, but let's go into the weird. Could you define weird?
So WEIRD is a backronym. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And we coined this backronym in 2010 in a paper we wrote for an academic journal to remind mostly psychologists, economists, anybody who does behavioral experiments, that most of the subject pool that they tapped in were not only one slice of human diversity among many, but a particularly cognitively, psychologically unusual slice of human diversity. So that you would want to be cautious about any generalizations. So we thought weird was a good way of reminding them that the people they typically studied, weird people, are not representative of humans in general.
Okay, so you've highlighted the weird people problem in psychology research. How has this lack of diversity in study participants influenced our understanding of human psychology?
Well, if you look at just even today, typical psychological textbooks or the papers published in the leading psychological journals, they'll talk about humans or what people do or the biases and heuristics of human decision making. But it turns out that in most cases, we either already know that these facts don't generalize to humans in general, to humans all over the planet and back into history, or we just don't know because we only have data from this narrow population. So it really is a way of thinking about how little we know about human differences. And my own enterprise is to say, well, look, there are lots of psychological differences. Now let's try to explain them.
So, okay, so this is something you've written about that I find fascinating. What is that called again?
That's called the Mueller-Lyer illusion.
Okay, okay. And so if you live in the West, the one on the bottom looks smaller. And
Yep.
if you don't live in the West, you see them as equal.
Well, you find global variation all around the world. So,
Okay.
work going back to the 1960s shows that it's strongest in urban populations of the kind typically studied were American undergraduates at the time. But you can find this, you can measure the magnitude of this illusion by gradually making the bottom line longer so that it gets bigger and it's actually longer than the top line. And you can show the populations around the world. You'll have to keep changing that line to make it bigger and bigger. So when you do that in, say, the US, you have to make it 20% longer before people see them as the same length. But then there's populations which don't see the illusion at all, and there's everything in between. Now, there's no one that goes the other way that sees it the reverse way. So, of course, there's boundaries on this variation.
Okay, so what is causally responsible for that?
Well, that has understudied, but the best theory we have is that it has to do with the carpentered corners, the 90-degree angles that dominate the visual world that most of us grow up in. So if you look at the corners of your doors or your tables, your furniture, the way your house is built, it's a lot of boxes and 90-degree angles. So your eyes calibrate because your retina actually receives a two-dimensional image of the light that hits it, and then your brain turns it back into a three-dimensional image. So in doing that, it creates lots of visual illusions, and this is one of them. But what we didn't know is that over ontogeny, growing up in these different visual worlds, our brains and minds adapt to guessing what it's looking at. So in this case, our brains make a guess that we're looking at something that has depth, but it doesn't have depth, so we get the answer wrong.
You know, I don't smoke pot, but if I smoke pot, I would love to hang out with you and just talk to you. Okay, so this illusion, so like the cultural causal. So, do you think it's the Whorf hypothesis? You think it's it
No, I don't
could be
think.
a
I think it's
linguistic
just
component?
It's the construction of the visual environment. So the populations that don't see the illusion live in the Kalahari Desert. So Southern Africa, they don't have any. Their houses are actually kind of roundish. So they build these small brush houses, and it's a big desert. And there's nothing. There's not very many right angles in the environment at all, so that they don't see this.
Interesting. So okay, so that's a visual thing. I guess my mind is tending toward the moral. So, I've thought for a long time about moral relativism. I'm opposed to it. I do think that there are moral facts, but if there are different, it's not even that there are psychological propensities. That wouldn't be the best way to think about it. But there are so many potential cultural influences that change the way we think about fundamental features of reality. I'm kind of thinking out loud here.
Yeah.
Um, and so that really would be a kind of argument for postmodernism, right? It would be a kind of argument for the privilege of the localized cultural traditions as opposed to just these rationally derivable empirical phenomena. Did that make
Well,
sense?
I see, I know where you're going, and
Yeah.
so the way this argument is often constructed is that you have rationalists and economists and scientists on one side, and then you have the postmodernists and the humanities folks on the other side. I've always tried to say that that is the wrong way to divide up the world, and that we're animals. So I'm a Darwinian biologist, and one of the things about humans is our minds have evolved to have a lot of plasticity, which
Mm,
allows us to adapt to our world in all kinds of ways. One of the ways we adapt to our world is that we adapt visually to the environment. So there's all kinds of different things we see and sense and perceive, and we get better at sensing and perceiving the most common things in our environment. So if we
mm,
grow up in a world with carpentered corners, we get better at spotting a carpentered corner.
mm,
One of the interesting pieces of variation around the world is there's English, and English speakers are particularly bad at sense. So English, the language, doesn't have very many good words for describing sense. We often have to say it smells like and then name some actual thing. Whereas
mm,
in the visual realm, we have a basic colors, all kinds of subcolors, and we can really partition that area up. But some societies, especially hunter gatherers, have a rich vocabulary of sense smells, and they spend a lot of time describing things. Some languages even force you to do it grammatically. So people get
mhm.
really good at detecting scents. And that's because they use scent in navigating their life and figuring out what to eat and all those kinds of things, where many of us don't rely on scent to that degree.
So I want to talk about your economic and political impacts of kinship structures. So your work has touched on the economic and political implications of cousin marriages. So I was wondering if you could expand on how these kinship structures affect modern economic or political systems.
Yeah. So first, I think a little background. Most listeners will have grown up in a world where it's mostly small monogamous nuclear families. People don't rely on kin bonds for economic production or for other kinds of important social purposes. They may not know who their second cousins are, and they certainly don't know who their third cousins are. Whereas that is unlike most of human history, where humans built up our social structure by extending kin bonds. So most families were extended families. When couples got married, they had to live with either the groom's parents or the bride's parents, so they became part of that productive unit. People often had to marry some form of cousin, or at least they were encouraged to. This created bonds between families and allowed that family to be more powerfully socially and economically. Polygynous marriage was very common, where elite and high status men could take additional wives, leading them to have large lineages. So, all these things allowed people and communities to build these dense networks using kinship as a base, but then adding various social norms and institutions to it. So, this was the formation of production and politics, and all this stuff lies at the foundation. Now, to get the kinds of institutions, the impersonal institutions, democracy, corporate governance, all the kinds of stuff we think about in the modern world, this is hard to get to from that complex world of
Mhm,
kinship. So the kinship structures were broken down into monogamous nuclear families, which allowed these more complex institutions to form. And so part of the story is cousin marriage. It's kind of an easy one because the Catholic Church in the early Middle Ages begins tabooing marriages to cousins, and people are forced to look further away, further afield, people marrying people of different ethnic groups and whatnot. Um, and so this actually, I argue in my book, The Weirdest People in the World, opens the door to the formation of these other impersonal institutions, which we begin seeing emerging in Europe by the High Middle Ages, roughly.
Okay, so let's segue into this, because I was reading what you said about the Catholic Church and the Christian Church. So the Western Christian Church's marriage and family program, MFP, which includes prohibitions against cousin marriage, fundamentally altered family structures in Western Europe. This shift reduced clannishness, promoted individualism, and led to the development of institutions that fostered trust in strangers. Now, here's the key thing: analytical thinking and impersonal prosociality. How does it affect analytical thinking?
So I think the best way to get there is to realize that in this world of kinship that I was describing, everything is about relationships. And so it's kind of it's not unlike the Muller-Lyer illusion, that thing that I was mentioning before, where you're expecting there to be these right angled corners, so you see an illusion that's not there. In a world where everything is about relationships and about managing relationships and creating trust through networks of relationships, you tend to look for relationships between things. And that leads you to more holistic thinking as opposed to analytic thinking. And then as you break down those kinship structures, it's more about finding individuals with certain dispositions. So you might be looking for trustworthy partners, intelligent partners, because you're not tied by all these bonds of kinship. And
Mm,
to a kind of marketplace of relationships and eventually to these other institutions. But the pathway to analytic thinking is when you're navigating that world, you're looking for individuals with characteristics or dispositions or whatnot. And that's like analytic thinking in the sense that objects are assigned properties, and then you explain the behavior of a system using analytic thinking based on those properties. So, a couple simple examples: when physicists want to explain the behavior of particles or planets, they assign property, right? They assign charges
mm.
to fundamental particles, electrons and protons. They assign gravity to planets, and then those explain the subsequent behavior of the whole system. Economists assign preferences, psychologists assign personalities, and that explains the behavior. But in lots of places and times, if you wanted to explain behavior, you needed to know what the relationship was between two people. Are they cross cousins or parallel cousins? In one case, they're going to preferentially mate and marry. And in the other case, they have a joking relationship, and any kind of sex would be taboo. So it's about the relationships. And this then leads off and affects how you generally approach the world.
Okay, so I have two, if I may push back on that, I have two criticisms, potential criticisms. The first is that that wouldn't affect analytic think. How would that affect analytic thinking? And the second one is, do you think that you've just presupposed the idea of the way you look for a mate? Maybe most men, kind of some biological imperatives, they just look for hot women. Not to be vulgar about it, but maybe, like, why would you assume that there are other qualities? Like, I'm thinking about Plato's Symposium. Why would you assume that they would look for a mate what you would look for in a mate?
Well, so let's start with the mate thing. So if we go into the world of intensive kinship, uh, nobody really cares about your opinion about what you want your mate to be, because other people like your grandfather and your father and stuff are going to be selecting your mate based on how they can best form the clan and whatnot. And so they're going to be concerned with the wealth of her family, the strength of the relationship, the economic and social consequences of the union. And maybe they'll take your opinion into account at some point. Same thing on the female side. So you might not be doing a lot of the picking there because of the prevalence of arranged marriages. When you move into the market world, it's still traits about the mate you're looking for. So it's still a trait-based thing as opposed to the
I see.
relation-based
So,
thing.
so it's not
There's
kind of, you're not the protagonist in your own story,
right.
like somebody else's.
Yeah, that's the key thing in the relationship world. You're often not the protagonist.
Huh.
And that actually has to do with something else that's important in this story, is the role of mental states and intentions. So as this kinship system is broken down, people start worrying a lot about other people's mental states and intentions. So I discussed research there where we did it all around the world, and we looked at the kinship of the different societies, and we gave them scenarios where a theft occurred. But we varied the details of the stories as to whether the person did it on purpose or they did it by accident. And to someone raised in a society like mine or yours, a weird society, it seems obvious and intuitive that intention matters a lot. If someone stole it by accident, you're just not going to blame them as much. That may seem obvious, but we did it in other places. People were like, those are the same. The stuff's still getting removed from this one person. The person has lost his valuable asset. And the other person should have been less careless and shouldn't have taken it. So they didn't seem to care as much or sometimes at all about the mental states of the actor. It was what the outcome was. So
Wow. Okay. So once again, another topic I could drill down on for 20 minutes, but I want to keep talking about your body of work. Just on the role of religion in society, something that I've been fascinated with for a long time. So, given your interest in cultural practices and how cultural practices shape society, what role do you think religion plays in the modern world, particularly in shaping social norms and political structures?
Well, I mean, the thing that I focus most on in religion is trying to understand its role in influencing human sociality. So I'm
Mm,
interested in the problem of cooperation. So we've done a lot of research on how belief in the gods of modern religions leads people to be more trusting and fair-minded
mm.
in social interactions. So a simple thing we've done is we give people an experiment. We put a sum of money online, say $50, and then they can give as much of that $50 to this second person who is an unknown stranger, and so they can give from 0 to the full amount, 0 to 50. And we find that people who believe in more punishing, more knowing gods are more likely to give more, or they're more likely to give towards half, right? So generally, people don't give more than half the money. In many places, people think the right thing to do is to give half, and so they sort of approach giving 50%. And we've done that around the world in places where there's a lot of variation in people's religious beliefs, and we find the effects in those places.
So,
We've done that a few times.
so that, so are you specifically, is the marker there whether or not they believe in a wrathful God?
Yes, it turns out that the punishment of the god is important and how much the god knows. So most people don't realize this, but supernatural agents, gods across human societies, are often limited in what they know. So, for example, I lived in Fiji for a long period, working in these remote villages, and the people there will talk about the ancestor gods as watching from dark places. But if you ask them, well, can the ancestor god see you when you go to town? No, the ancestor gods cannot see you when you go to town. Can they see you inside your house? Well, only if they're looking through the window, um,
Yeah.
those kinds of things. Whereas, Protestants tend to believe not only can God see what you're doing, but he or she can see inside your heart.
Yeah, I
And
think
yeah,
Clifford Gertz has written, if I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I looked at that. So from this is a tad different, but it's related. I remember reading when I was into the New Atheist movement. I remember reading about um, the effects of intercessory prayer, and I just a little debate with Jonathan Preju about that and and and, and others. And I remember reading about the idea that people who are in these religious communities um, tend to have health outcomes that are better than those who don't. And when you really drill down, this is just a parenthetical, maybe just for myself, but when you really drill down on that, the factor they're really testing is community, because you don't really test from what I read for the research, from what I remember, like they tested it against, the control wasn't really a control. It was like you would need to test that against people who have strong community. Like my buddy in jujitsu, he's one of my teachers. He became paralyzed, not from jujitsu, and he had a constant stream of people. In fact, two of my training buddies are just with him now in Chicago. He's still basically paralyzed. Um, and my bet would be that that kind of support would affect healing outcomes. But what you're talking about is something that's different. Yeah, I don't know about this, the degree to which the god or gods are omniscient. I mean, not just money. I mean, that would also be indicative of something else, right? I mean, it would probably be indicative of suite of behavioral characteristics or attitudinal dispositions. Again, I'm just thinking out loud since I haven't read the
yeah. I mean,
research.
what our story is that cultural evolution is operating over time, and one of the pressures that is on cultural evolution is to make groups more cooperative, because
Yeah.
groups that are more cooperative through whatever reason are able to survive and spread and outcompete other groups. And one of the things that can help do that is if you have a god that you believe is going to be very punishing and wants you to do very cooperative things, things that lead to the success of your group, then the belief in that kind of God tends to spread. And so we
Yeah,
think that
yeah,
over
yeah.
millennia of human history, the size of gods have gotten bigger. Gods have gotten concerned about the things that actually lead, that maintain stable communities, maintain internal harmony, and lead to success in intergroup competition, and help people in those situations where, narrow self-interest or nepotism would otherwise cause them to
Yeah.
do one action, but the what's good for the group is another action, like not stealing or something like that. Um, and that the effects might be small, but at the margins over thousands of years, those small effects matter.
Yeah. So, this is fascinating to me. Uh, Brett Weinstein's a buddy of mine, and he gave a guest lecture in my class years ago. And he was saying that it's thinking about religion in terms of truth claims is just the wrong way to do it. When I've had conversations with Christian apologists, that's one of the reasons they criticize. They're criticizing the truth claims, and you've written. I mentioned that as a segue because you've mentioned this the woman who doesn't eat eel when she's pregnant because she doesn't want the baby to have scales. But that's so talk about that because I find that fascinating because it would seem to me that the apologists who are criticizing me that there's a there, that there's something there of not of thinking about it propositionally. But go ahead.
Yeah. So where I think you're going is that there's a kind of cultural evolution operates behind the scenes. We're just learning from other people. We're selective about what we're learning. And there's also this intergroup competition where more successful groups proliferate. So all that cashes out, meaning that cultures tend to embody a kind of wisdom
Yeah.
that the people ingesting the culture or using it don't totally understand all the causality and stuff that's going on behind the scenes. So you refer to the Fijian food taboos, which what I found in Fiji is that women had a bunch of taboos on things they couldn't eat during pregnancy and breastfeeding. So we made a list of them. We did a ton of interviews, found out all these different, and they turned out to be foods that medical science and biology says is high in ciguatera. Now they didn't know
Hmm.
anything about ciguatera. They just knew you're not supposed to eat these foods when you're pregnant and breastfeeding. But the ciguatera would damage the fetus, and it could get into the breast milk in the same way that hot spices can get into the breast milk. So by avoiding these, women were protecting their babies from all this stuff. They didn't learn by experience because they just didn't do it. So if you have a good taboo, people don't tend to break it and you don't get any information. But sticking to the taboo is healthy for their children.
Do you think going to these different places and immersing yourself has this caused a subjective turn in your thinking? In other words, has this made you value the primacy of subjectivity over an objectively knowable world? Like, do you think things are more cultural artifacts now than timeless truths?
Well, yeah, I mean that one of the things that I'm interested in now, and part of this comes from having lived in a number of different societies, is I always turn my vision back to my own society and something like
Yeah.
epistemology. So how do we know what we know, or how do we know what constitutes a good argument, or what's good evidence? Is actually a culturally evolved, culturally constructed thing. Now that doesn't mean there aren't better institutions for generating good evidence and good arguments, but it's not something you can just think hard about and figure out. It's something that's evolved over many centuries of trying to produce, valid truth claims, better technologies, deeper insights, those kinds of things. So one of the things I'm working on now is the cultural evolution of epistemologies, thinking about, where did science come from? What kinds of epistemological systems did other societies use?
Are you? uh, You're not an epistemological relativist.
No, no, no. I mean, I kind of approach epistemology like technology, right? Some machetes are better than others.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I had a conversation with David Deutsch, the physicist from Oxford, and I've been reading and looking at his Twitter feed and such. God, he's another deep dude. Like his stuff is fantastic on that. He is just he's a Paparian, so he's falsifiability is his shtick, or he's thinks that as I do that you can construct institutions and societies learning curricula around these defeasibility and falsifiability
Mm.
ways of thinking about the world. Okay, cool. Hey, I'm just curious since I've been writing about it differently. What do you look for in your friends?
That's the first time I've been asked that question. Let's see. I don't know. It's just you just get a feel for it.
Do your friends have commonalities?
Well, they tend to be curious and intellectual types, I guess.
Would you end a friendship over a matter of politics? Like if someone was going to vote for somebody else that you didn't like?
No, I mean, in general, I pride myself on engaging with them over that, not ending a friendship over that.
Yeah, and I think that you put your finger on. I think that's one of the problems, particularly with young people, but the whole society faces that now. And we're not talking to each other. We're not talking across divides in particular. So the commonality among your friend set is that they're curious about things.
Yeah, I think I haven't actually thought too deeply about it, but just sitting here with you now and kind of passing over them, I think that's probably true.
And what do you do with your friends?
I go kayaking sometimes, and my kayaking buddies are all fit that bill. I like to have a cocktails, beers from time to time, social activities, dinner, the usual stuff. I'd
And
say
do you
those are.
talk about work with them? What do you talk about?
Yeah, I talk obsessively about science. So,
Oh, that's good. What has nobody asked you that you want them to ask you?
gosh, well, I don't have anything for you there. I mean, lately, as I was mentioning, I've been obsessed with this idea of the collective brain, that we really think as communities and that new ideas arise through the recombination of ideas, which means all kinds of things about social networks and social interconnectedness and population size
Mm,
affect the emergence of innovation. And I'm talking about the creation of, new musical compositions by classical composers,
huh.
fancy new technological patents, the whole range, all the things we would count as human creativity. So I've been writing on a book, so I'm deep in several literatures on that at the same time.
Do you think that you would okay, this is a weird question. If there were intelligent life in the universe, do you think that you would see the influence of culture on their cognitions? I don't even know where I'm going with this, but I guess
So I think the pathway to our cognitive abilities, our individual level cognitive abilities, is through cultural evolution. So I think cultural evolution drove our genetic evolution that resulted in the expansion of our brains. But even putting aside the genetic evolution, it's still the case that we're smart because we get a good download of cultural stuff. So something like
yeah.
a numbering system seems like a basic thing, but lots of societies count one, two, three, many, and they don't have numbers to differentiate 36 and 37, or they don't have
Wow.
fractions. All these things were accumulated over generations of human cultural evolution, and it's these things that are give us the tools to think with.
Okay, so this is something I've been thinking about a long time. Did you ever play the game Civilization?
Very very long time ago, so I
Yeah.
don't remember any details.
So they have like these technology trees, and to get from A to B to C to D, like you need the previous technology.
Hmm.
And I was like, to get to something, you need, I can't remember what it is, but you need the wheel, and then you get, and I was wondering if like, if those really were necessary, like if you could have a spacefaring civilization that didn't develop the wheel.
Hmm. Yeah, it would have to be something that would be hard for us to imagine because it would be a
Yeah.
completely different kind of creature. Like, I don't know an evolutionary path that would lead to what we would call an intelligent creature that doesn't involve a high level of sociality and culture, meaning that you have to learn from each other, you have to swap ideas because it allows us to be much smarter than any single individual could ever be. Now, maybe there's another pathway. Like one of my graduate students, we built this computational model of the evolution of cognition, and we found what we think is the human pathway where you get genes and culture co-evolving and one drives the other. But we did find a smaller pathway that we didn't expect where you would just get bigger brains based on individual learning and experiencing the environment. So he's been looking at encephalopods,
Mm.
octopuses, to see if they're maybe that other pathway.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I don't need octopus for ethical reasons, but so Reed has put up a chart here: humans, chimpanzees, orangutans.
Yeah, this is a famous experiment done by Esther Herman and Mike Tomasello at the Max Planck Institute, and they tested a bunch of human children. So the humans are 2.5-year-olds,
Hmm.
and then about 100 chimpanzees and a whole bunch of orangutans. And they gave them a battery of 18 cognitive tests. And so you can see that the chimps and the children aren't very different on space tasks, quantity tasks, and causality tasks. In the causality bin is tool use, and the chimps actually outperform the humans in tool use. And then finally, social learning. And in devising a good social learning task, the kids they had trouble getting a task where the children weren't at ceiling and the apes at floor. So what we're really good at is learning from other individuals. And then that it gives us all the tools that later, like if you were to take this task, you would blow the roof off, you'd get 100%. It would seem simple to you.
You overestimate me.
That's because your head is full of pre-solved solutions for working on solving these problems.
Mm. Again, I keep coming back to the linguistic component. I know that we've taught sign language to chimps, for example, and or gorillas, et cetera, primates, um, and there's never been a single example of a primate asking a question like with sign language. I think the only one is, if I remember correctly, it was a parrot who asked, "Am I gray?" It's the only example
Hmm.
ever. I just wonder, Reed, keep that chart up, man, would you? Okay, so this is one of the main the theses that you work around. It's that social learning is the claim that there's something unique about humans with social learning that then creates a culture, and then that's kind of covariant that those two things pull themselves up
Yeah,
on them.
so you need enough social learning abilities, enough sociality, so you begin to get cumulative cultural evolution, which all that means, that's a fancy term to mean that one generation builds on the prior generation. You don't lose, you don't fall backwards very much. Or at least if you do fall backwards, you have enough generation to kind of keep moving forward. And then that can begin to affect the genetic evolution. So
Huh.
genes and
Yeah.
culture begin doing a duet moving forward.
So
And
if you
language is just a
yeah.
part of that, right? Language is a kind of culture. It's our spoken system for communication.
So if you had a magic wand and it has three charges in the wand, and you can answer any three unasked questions from your field, what would they be?
Well, one question that just popped to my mind as you said that is, I'd like to know when the process started of this cumulative cultural evolution. And that's because there's a big debate. Some people think it didn't happen until a few 100,000 years ago, but I think, and I've made the case, that it happened over 1 million years ago. So we've been experiencing this gene culture coevolutionary process for a really long time. And I guess another thing I would want to know would be,
Huh.
what are the actual genes that went under selection to do that? So we're beginning to be able to isolate genes in the genome, and we can compare humans and chimps. So we should be able to figure out which genes are the ones that led to this better cognitive ability, or this could be just a motivational system. It could be we just want to spend more time with other members of our group and watch them a lot.
It's interesting. Jerry Coyne's a good friend of mine. It'd be interesting to hear a conversation between you two guys. Okay, so what is the? So you gave me two. You didn't give me three. Give me another. Do you have another one?
Three, let's see. Well, I mean, I guess my other one, I'd go a different direction and say I'd really like to get an assessment for the range of psychological plasticity. So, as we talked about with the weird thing, I've been trying to understand the range of human psychology while trying to understand human nature. But how much flexibility do we have in our motivational systems and the kinds of
Oh,
things we can like,
interesting.
and how much can we bend the psychology around?
What if you had a different one and you can answer any question about anything? What would it be?
Oh, that would yeah, you give me these hard questions. I need a little more time to think about it.
You don't have to-
I
It's all
guess I
right,
would wanna
man.
know what's wrong
Yeah,
with evolutionary theory. What are the main things we need to improve?
really interesting.
Or
And,
how can
and
we improve scientific epistemology to make it even better?
interesting. I just found out right before this that Richard Dawkins and I are going to do another talk in New Jersey. Um, yeah, I can ask him. I can ask him that question. So your research suggests that greater social interactional diversity has historically propelled American innovation. So, what mechanisms within diverse interactions foster innovations, and how can we apply these insights today? So this kind of conversation, I want to see if I can tease out some of your work to see if I can make society better, help people, ameliorate human suffering, et cetera. Like, what can I take the people listening to from your vast knowledge and body of work to make the world we're living in better?
Yep. So that result that you mentioned comes from this idea of the collective brain, and that's the idea that if we want to understand human creativity and innovation, we got to recognize that most ideas are recombinations, which means that if you have more minds interacting more frequently and the individuals are more cognitively diverse in some interesting and important ways, then you can generate more of this, more recombinations, more insights, and whatnot. So the question is how do you measure cognitive diversity, and how do you do it back in time where data is very sparse? One of the things we know is that there's a lot of learning from parents and family members. So what we decided to do is use the U.S. Census and use surnames as a measure. So people learn a lot from their same surname family members. So there's going to
Mm,
be a lineages of culture there. This allows us to compare, people who are Irish with other Irish folk rather than using country of origin, which is often done.
mm.
And so we took every county in the US over every decade and calculated how diverse the surnames are. And then we went to the US
Wow.
patent
Jeez.
database and we
Wow.
took every county and we looked at the number of patents per capita. Remember, this is patents per capita. So we're going to show that that increases the total productivity. We also calculated breakthrough patents per capita. There's about 1/10 the number of breakthrough patents, but these are patents that just had were very different from the past patents and had a big impact on future patents. And so we show that if you get more surname diversity, you get more breakthrough patents and more patents per capita. And we're able to make a causal argument because immigration, for various idiosyncratic random reasons, sometimes dumps various amounts of surnames into different US counties. And this gives them some kind of random, quasi-random variation. And from that, we can try to measure the actual causal impact on this innovation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay. Now okay. That is a huge, you just dumped a huge thing
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. So tear it apart. Let's go.
Okay. So, just one thing that's just floating through my mind. How many TAs did you have to do? You must have had a ton of research assistants to do that. That must have
Well,
cost a fortune.
we were able to take advantage of lots of existing research, and I actually had two different economics postdocs. So one of the cool things about my lab is I always have everything from religious studies scholars to economists, and so this is the economist end of the lab.
Okay. So the surnames, did it matter what those surnames were?
So one of the criticisms that one might worry about here, because a guy named Gregory Clark has argued that specific surnames made a lot of contributions, for example, over
That's
English history.
what I would think.
So
Yeah.
we did another analysis, which economists would call surname fixed effects. But
Mm.
basically, what we did was we looked at the same surname when they landed in more diverse and less diverse counties. So we held Henrichs constant. There's an overall effect of being a Henrich, and then we looked at whether Henrichs went to a place where there was, mostly other Henrichs or some other dominant surname, or went to a place with lots of different kind of people. And what we show is that the same surname was able to get more creative when they landed in a place with more other diverse surnames. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I'm thinking specifically. I'll reveal my cards. I'll take them away from my chest. I'm specifically thinking about Muslim immigration and what effect that would have. When did you do that study?
So our study focuses on the period when the U.S. rose to prominence, and so this is 1850 to
Mm,
1940. And during that period, there were some Muslim migrants for example, to Dearborn to work in the
yeah,
auto industry, but not many.
yeah. It'd be interesting to see. I don't know if it'd be possible to run that today.
So I mean, our study hasn't been done with modern data because you can't get the surnames for the census very
Exactly.
easily because of privacy concerns.
Oh, I thought you were gonna say something else. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
Although we're working on that, there's a way to get restricted access to the census, and my team is working on that. So I may have an answer for you there. But others have looked at immigration since 1964, which includes people from around the world. And immigration has a big impact on innovation. It's great for innovation. I don't know if anybody specifically looked at the influence of Muslim immigrants, it's certainly the case that different immigrant groups seem to have more or less impact on patents. And there's a bunch of, I mean, I have to deal with this in my book. There's a bunch of different
Is it,
reasons why that might be the case.
is
But
the
one of the
Dutch?
things that's easy
Yeah.
from my point of view is that I've we talked about some of the ideas I have about the relationship between kinship structures and things like trust in strangers, interest in creativity and whatnot. If you come from places like Pakistan with dense kinship networks, then you're going to be distrustful of strangers, and you're not going to be very interested in creativity. And so that means you're not going to, at least when you initially arrive, start contributing a lot of patents. So
Hmm. Usually academia selects for people who are really good at one thing. They're kind of, you know, as much as everybody clamors about the importance of or screeches about the importance of interdisciplinary work, I don't think they mean it. I think that's a total bullshit. But it must be difficult. Well, it is, because the way the promotion and tenure baskets are usually set up at universities and what they reward high impact factor journals, and those tend to be like, journal of psychology, journal of philosophy, and not interdisciplinary journals, which have lower. And then that factors into AT index. Anyway, so is it difficult for you to like work in so many fields, or does that make it easier for you?
I think it makes it easier. One, because it's super exciting and it's interesting, and I tend to be just driven by the idea, and I don't pay a lot of attention to the field. So a lot of times we'll come up with a result or an idea, and we're like, "Well, which field should we decide to pitch this to?" And then you have to decide whether you want to send it to economics or send it to a general science journal or make it. I was just having a discussion with some colleagues this morning, and we found that kinship intensity predicts what you might call an honor psychology. So more intensive groups with clans and stuff tend to produce this honor psychology, which is associated with violence and terrorism and things like that. Protection of women, all kinds of interesting stuff. And we could have pitched it to an econ audience or a psych audience. We decided to go with a psych journal in this case.
Interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Jonathan Haidt has some work in that. Does work there. Honor societies, victim societies, low trust societies. So what? Okay, so you pursue the idea, and you have total autonomy with what you want to pursue.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the great things about, I think it's a great thing about academia is I'm a full professor and nobody can tell me what to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. My friend, Carol Hooven, she worked there, and things didn't end up too well for her. But that's a story for another day.
Yeah. She was
So
not a full professor though.
yeah, she was not a full professor, right? So Bradley Campbell and Jason Manning, the rise of victimhood culture. So as I was wondering if we could touch on this. So it seems to me that we're living in a culture that valorizes victimhood, and there's like grievance jockeying for who wants to be the biggest victim and who has the most oppression variables in their past. First, do you agree with this broad stroke assessment?
I haven't studied this, but your account there meets with my own subjective impressions. Yeah.
Okay, so s- two things I want to ask. The first is are there any tools from your research that you know of that we can bring to bear on this catastrophe to help people not value being victims?
Not value being victims. Um, well, I mean, part of it is, I mean, my natural go-to place is the cultural evolutionary story, which at some point along the line, that people began to wear their victimhood like a badge,
Yeah.
and then others began to say, "Hey, that's a good thing to do. Wear your victimhood like a badge," right? So it became a prestigious, noteworthy thing to do. Um, I feel like there was a former time when people sort of hid that stuff, and
Mhm.
so it would be a question of reorienting what counts as prestigious, what we see as the a good way to be or the best way to be, what we valorize and whatnot. So now,
Yeah.
how to change that across a large population is always the tricky part.
Yeah, it's interesting because I tend to think about micro and macro interventions. We have an electorate that's interested in vibes. We have one candidate who's the vibe candidate who hasn't released, who literally, I can't even fathom, I'm a little older than you. I can't even fathom how you could have a candidate without releasing your policy positions. I mean, even if you had terrible policy positions, at least you can say, here are my policy positions. If you don't like them, go screw yourself. But you don't even have, like, do you have anything do you have any thoughts about this? Anything from your work about this, or specifically with regard to an intervention, or how we can help people think or understand that it's important to know what your politicians are going to do before you vote for them?
Well, is what we're seeing an erosion of norms, right? So it used to be that people didn't do these things because they had to do them. They did them because they thought they were supposed to do them, and everyone expected them to reveal, detail their policy plans, have a clear platform, all the kinds of things that used to go on. And it seems like those are eroding. So the question is, why are all the old norms eroding, and how do we restore the norms? Or, I mean, you could always make laws, right? But it's not clear how the laws would help in this particular case, but they could
Mm.
help with some things.
So how do you help people? And this is going to sound so patriarchal and so condescending, but how do you, and so elitist too, and I don't mean it to sound that way. How do you help people value the right things? Like, how do you help people value the fact that it shouldn't be about vibes? It should be about what people are going to do,
Right.
like in terms of what their public policies are, and then you can have a rational, evidence-based conversation on, geez, is this the kind of direction we want to take the society? Are these the public policies that we want? Like, how do you help people value that?
Do you know of good evidence, as to whether we've actually seen an erosion in that? Because, of course, when I encounter something like this, my first question is this a real fact? Meaning that there was a time when people were not concerned with vibes and were focused on.
Yeah, no, I think people were always concerned with vibes. I was thinking about Dan Quayle, and early polling suggested that many women liked Dan Quayle because he was a good-looking guy.
Yeah, and I remember Dukakis put on that helmet, and that was like the end
Yeah.
of his campaign because he looked like a little kid in the helmet.
Yeah, I remember that. Our dean jumped up on the he acted like a crazy man for
Woo!
2 seconds. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, you're
Now
exactly
that would be literally nothing. But,
right.
um, let's be clear, I'm thinking about, Plato's Republic, when reason should be the lead horse of the chariot. Public policies and the kind of societies we wanna make for ourselves and how we wanna treat our most vulnerable. I mean, these are indispensable questions for civilized society. I do think another horse on the chariot should be, what the person's vibes are. Like, if the person is a creeper, okay, well, if there's something to that, you know, that should play some role. Or if he's just generally dyspeptic, that should play a role as well. But there's something about substituting that lead horse on the chariot with vibes, that's just completely insane. It's just insane.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it's always been a frustration of mine that it can't just be policy, or it should be dominated by policy-based discussions, details of, okay, here's the one policy proposal. What do we know about how that's going to work? Here's another policy proposal. What do we know?
Yeah, I
But
mean,
I mean, it's hard to find a news show where they actually get into enough weeds that you could make a decision, right?
yeah, and I don't even care, frankly. I don't even give a shit what people think. I couldn't care less what the person thinks about abortion. I only want to know what they're going to do.
Yeah.
Do you think that process, and let's just accept by fiat for a moment, and you can question or challenge this if you don't want to accept this as a fiat proposal or proposition, that the exercise of engaging in street epistemology or spectrum street epistemology really does help one calibrate their confidence in their beliefs to the evidence. Would it be a human universal, that would be good for all people, all cultures, and all societies? Like in Fiji, if we went in and we did spectrum street epistemology in Fiji about their claims, or could it be that when you ask them about eating eel when you're pregnant, and they realize that the whole Plato's Theaetetus, knowledge is true justified belief, they have truth, they don't have justification, and they have belief, therefore they don't have knowledge, so that you could actually do them some harm. But yeah, so there's the idea. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's a possibility, and that's kind of an interesting possibility. I mean, I think that you could. if you could get people to go down those roads, you could, in principle, demolish a lot of religions. I mean, I'm an atheist, but Richard Dawkins style atheist, but that doesn't. Richard would probably disagree with me, but I think that would do serious damage to a lot of cooperation. People would start getting unhealthier because religion forms the basis of sociality, and that sociality
Mhm.
has a lot of positive effects. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of downstream effects that would occur.
Yeah, it's I came up with street epistemology in my first book, A Manual for Creating Atheists, and it since broadened from faith and God to other things.
I
Okay,
mean, people
cool.
wouldn't know what to eat. Like one of my jokes is that
Yeah,
as Americans, we have no idea what one should eat. Like if you, the medical recommendations on the healthy diet have been
so
changing decade
true.
by decade. And like, now you think, oh, we know now, but actually 10 years from now, it'll be totally different.
I wonder if that's true. I mean, I don't think you can argue that it's a case of verisimilitude. You're getting closer and closer. Like the food pyramid is probably one of the biggest scams. I mean, who just thinking about that, putting grain in the bottom at the base of the food pyramid. And I think it's also what's caused so much public distrust in science, not the food pyramid per se, but there's just a wholesale distrust in our institutions. And maybe this is where we disagree, but I think that trust is largely warranted. And I think we need to do what we can to re to not reinstitutionalize trust, but to give people a reason to value our institutions. But I will tell you, the Harvard brand, as you know, has been severely damaged recently. And I will tell you the number one thing that you can do, in my opinion, you don't have to comment on this if you don't want to help public trust of Harvard. Fire plagiarists.
Hmm.
Your whole diversity office is filled with plagiarists. I think it's like what, four people now. Claudine Gay, and not even plagiarists, just serial plagiarists. And again, you don't have to comment on it because you're an employee there. But I think that I think the postmodernists have it backwards. It's not that the brand confers. It's not that like people trust the brand. The idea is that there's something behind the brand. So it's not this manufactured, ersatz.
Yeah. Well, I
You know,
mean, you and I certainly agree on that. I mean, I'm on the Council of Academic Freedom. I've
oh,
tried.
with Pinker, Steve is on that too.
Steve leads it. I'm just a simple member who stands in the background, but I'm supportive of that enterprise.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. If I had said to you or anybody 10, 12 years ago, maybe not 10, we should fire people who plagiarize, specifically serial plagiarists, you would look at me like I had lost my mind. Like you would look at me like, well, of course, like, who's this guy? What is his problem? But now, now you say that that's some kind of great controversy. I love how yeah, we just see this over and over again. But so
Yeah.
let me throw
So
this
I
out
don't
to
think
you.
that's controversial. I mean, I think most people would agree that, plagiarism is a big problem and we should police it. I
But
mean,
it's
there's
not
an
being
entire office devoted to this.
but you're not firing them. They're still in there.
Yeah, you have me at a loss because I don't know any details about this. So.
Yeah, well, I'm telling you, the same people that are Claudine Gay is a $900,000 a year salary. She teaches. She retained her full professorship. I mean, the other thing is, we could have a conversation, not now, but like, okay, obviously you fire them, but do you revoke their degrees because they were obtained fraudulently? I mean,
Mm.
that's fraud. You've committed fraud. You've lied, and then you've leveraged that for financial and reputational gain. But okay, so bracketing that for a second, or pushing that aside. So, yeah, no, I do think that the lack of trust in our institutions is a problem, and I'd love to see like your work and others' work because I do think that your stuff. I'm telling you, man, your stuff is just fascinating. Like, and it always pops up in some way in a conversation that I'm having with someone about whatever it is that
Hmm.
we're talking about. I want to ask you a couple more quick questions about divination, witchcraft, and the rationality question.
Okay.
You've written about witchcraft and divination, yes?
Yep.
Talk to me about that.
Well, I mean, We're interested in getting back to the cultural practice idea. Why is it that witchcraft and divination practices are so common across societies? So, anthropologists have long documented different kinds of divination where you're trying to predict the future, find out why you're ill, those kinds of things. And you go to a specialist or whatever across small scale societies. But I got involved with my student, Kevin Hong. Who was able to analyze this corpora of data from China going back 2,000 years, and the Chinese state was engaging in various divination practices, the interpretation of dreams to predict the future, and putting state power and state resources behind this for 2,000 years, including we have a paper coming out on rain rituals, rituals to cause it to rain. And,
Oh,
you
wow.
might think that somebody should process the data. We actually process the data. And if you did process the data from these Chinese records, it would tell you that the rain rituals work. Uh, I mean, it's clearly I don't think the rain rituals actually work. So clearly, there's some kind of bias in the creation of the records. Anyway, and so we make a case about why these things can persist and how divination works in a way that allows us to spread culturally and whatnot.
What societies specifically are you thinking of?
Well, divination. So, if you look at the anthropological record, generally societies have some kind of something that is like divination. So, a lot of times this is kind of medical treatment, but it could be like, is my baby going to be a male or a female? So that was big in China, where you would go to a diviner to find out the sex of your future fetus, because people wanted males and they didn't want females.
Mm,
Um, but incredibly widespread. You find it in ancient Greece, Rome. These guys they all use diviners. Kings use diviners. So it's just a practice that we think is clearly inconsistent with scientific thinking.
mm.
It would have produced evidence that you would think could falsify the practice, but yet it persisted across time and space.
Yeah, it's not divining, but Reagan had an
Yep.
astrologer in the White
Yeah, and
House.
astrology seems to be making a comeback. I get a Google feed on the word witchcraft, and it looks to
Oh,
me like people are searching more on witchcraft, and there's more articles about witchcraft prosecutions in Papua New Guinea, India, Nigeria. So
really?
I think there's
Yeah.
a resurgence of witchcraft interests.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. There's something about the sort of feeling of instability in the world. So this is an old
Mm.
anthropological idea, goes back to a guy named Malinowski at least, where when the world feels more uncertain, people resort to more magic and ritual beliefs.
Oh, interesting.
So
Yeah,
it
we
could be that climate change, economic instability, just knowing about all the bad stuff happening around the world could be causing people to feel uneasy.
yeah, interesting. I've been asking people about what I term the substitution hypothesis. I don't know if I came up with that or what, but the idea that basically there's a God-shaped hole in one's heart, and as traditional religions either fall into ill repute or don't have the cachet and the status, et cetera, that they once did people is there a kind of like a homeostasis, like they'll fill that out with something that else, some other belief in the culture? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to do well, so my first pass idea on this is that we have all this theory and evidence suggesting that under uncertainty, people rely more on learning from others. Which means they're relying less on their own analysis of the world because
Mm,
it's uncertain and unstable, and they rely more on conformity type beliefs. So they
mm,
look at
mm.
what everybody else is doing. So you could see that could lead to the spread of these things within social networks and stuff. So your friends are doing witchcraft. This happens among college students now. Apparently, they're actually casting spells. There are TikTok videos. Go into TikTok. You'll see TikTok videos about spell casting. Uh,
Huh. That's interesting. What beliefs have you changed as a result of your going around the world and studying this? And I mean, like, what personal beliefs have you changed in a way that have affected your interactions with other people?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing for me has been the recognition that people across the world think very differently. So
Mm,
earlier we started to get into this kind of economic territory. And one of the things that I sometimes get heat for is I think that the economic prospects of different populations are influenced by aspects of their psychology, which depends on many things. But one of the things it's affected by is this family stuff. So something like
huh.
being distrustful of strangers makes your economic system work less well. So
Huh.
you should worry about how trusting your population is, because it affects how your institutions operate and people's willingness to do business with strangers, which affects entrepreneurialism, all kinds of things.
God, life is so complicated, because when you were saying that, I was thinking about the Islamic prohibition on intrust. And then I was thinking about the conversation about culture and trusting. I mean, but we just look for these kind of univariate causal explanations of things. I just think that people like these kind of easy explanations, but life is complicated, man. Reality is complicated. And that's one of the reasons I think that your work is so interesting, is because the cultural, it's just given me a sense of, I think in a sense I'm too reason driven in a sense, and I'm too kind of evidence driven. And I have to remember that it's not the vagaries of human experience and the fact that we're emotional creatures or what have you, but the culture really does play a very profound role in shaping not only one's outlook, but even one's epistemologies. Of course, if I were arguing against myself, I'd say that that's more of a reason to have a rigorous epistemology and not less, right? More of a reason to have a robust epistemologies. Okay, cool. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
Let's see. I don't think so. I mean, yeah, I mean, the main thing that I thought you would be interested in was this relationship between psychology, economics, and political institutions, actually. But
The main thing that I was really interested in is the weird stuff.
okay,
But I
yeah,
figured that you talked about that to death, and you were probably sick. Was my supposition correct? You just talked about it to death, and you're sick of talking about it.
no, I'm happy to talk about it anytime. Eventually, I'm going to do a second edition, so I'm always kind of
Oh,
gathering.
you are.
And we've gathered a lot more data. So, for example, I can show that the arrival of the church in medieval Europe led to more creativity in those locales, in those populations, a few centuries after the bishopric arrives, which is surprising to many people because they intuitively associate religion and the Catholic Church with sort of conformity, closed-mindedness, and stuff. But that may be true in some sense, but because of what it does to the kinship and cousin marriage system, it leads to more creatives.
God, that's fascinating. That's so interesting. And
And
you
more,
say that,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, you say that as you're evidence based. You don't have an axe to grind against. I mean, you yourself are an atheist, right? So
Right.
you're not. Yeah, it's really interesting. Oh, cool. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our
Yeah,
conversation.
it was good hanging out.
Where can people find you?
Well, if you just Google my name, Joesph Henrich, you'll find my website, and all my pubs and stuff are available there. And
Henrich.
that's right.
Excellent. And you're on X, and you've written a lot of great books. The Weirdest People in the World, The Secret of Our Success, and very exciting. So I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking.
Thanks. Great being with you.
Right on, man. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. This falls under the umbrella of my nonprofit, National Progress Alliance. Your generous donations keep us going and help fuel content like this. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.